bank it ahead. Konechny tips it. He got it past the defenseman and gets to the puck. Konechny cutting it on goal. He scores! A beauty from Konechny, and the Flyers take a 1-0 lead. Beat the defenseman, then beat the goaltender. And then Konechny's third goal in the last 2 games has the Flyers on top.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. I'm here with my partner for this O&B special, Anthony DiMarco from thefourthperiod.com. How are you, Anthony?
Not too bad, man. What about you?
All right, doing okay. Hey, just today's show, we're going to talk about, I guess, an overview of where the Flyers are at. I know it's only, 7 games, but it's a short season, and a lot of people, based on what the Flyers have been doing, have had some very strong opinions about who the Flyers were coming out of the bubble and what they may be going forward right now, and calling into question some of the moves or non-moves that Chuck Fletcher made. But before we carry on, just a reminder, FlyersNittyGritty.com, sponsor of the O&B Puckcast, is sponsored by Jim's South Street. Jim's Steaks and Hoagies, 400 South Street, 4 decades of providing that with or without taste that you got to have. And if you're down near 400 South Street and you can't make it over, they use DoorDash, so the delicious food can be delivered right to your door. So don't forget, Jim's South Street, right on 400 South Street. Anthony, why don't we talk about where the Flyers are at? You know, they win last night versus the Devils. You know, when you watch a team over a short span, especially coming out of the gate, you get a general impression of what they are versus expectation, you know?
Look, personally, I'm not shocked in the slightest from what I saw. Coupled with what happened in the bubble and the defense, the massive step back that it took due to the retirement of Nat Niskanen and Chuck Fletcher subsequently doing nothing to properly address it, because I'm not considering the Eric Gustafson signing addressing it. I expected this, and you know, I think Carter Hart hasn't been at his typical phenom level and I'm not blaming him in the slightest. And I think had it not been for the offense seemingly hitting on all cylinders early games, you would have seen a much worse record. But the Flyers are a talented team. They have talent on this roster. And as the saying goes, good teams find a way to win. And I think maybe aside from last night's performance against Jersey, which by all accounts was much better, this team found ways to win in spite of their very, very poor play. And if you look around the East Division as a whole, there's some parity. But, I mean, aside from the New York Islanders, who I picked to win the Stanley Cup, who even I can objectively say are a long shot to do so, there's not any, like, top-tier elite-level teams. Like, there's no Tampa Bay, there's no Vegas, there's no Colorado here, even a Toronto. There's no team like that. So, I mean, I think the Flyers, now sitting, I believe, tied for second in the East Division, is exactly where I thought they would be. And I predicted them to finish second in the East. I said from the beginning I thought they were going to make the playoffs. I would be relatively shocked if they didn't. But through the first 7 games, I could personally say that this team is doing exactly what I expected.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think through 7 games, look, the record says 4-2-1. The style of play or the process that is, as it is so often referred to, has not been great. Last night might have marked a turn towards a better process where the structure seemed to come back a little bit in certain sequences of the game, and other times it hasn't. Of course, complicating the situation are a spate of injuries to players like Sean Couturier, who's kind of like the backbone of their structure game. Defenseman Phil Myers, who has a rib injury, and it's hard to say when he'll be coming back. And of course,
Morgan Frost got hurt, but
right.
I wouldn't consider him.
Yeah, Morgan Frost was always going to be a part-time contributor, but his injuries, actually dislocated shoulder, is pretty nasty. So that's kind of where they're at. Now, I think last night's game kind of reminded me a little bit of the first Pittsburgh game, where they had some power play goals, used some momentum, and were able to overcome the fact that they were basically outplayed. But they played a little bit better than that last night. More to your point, it brings us to what we identified as weaknesses or areas for concern coming out of the bubble last year, where I think the Flyers were out physicaled, that Flyers lacked some jam. They were a little bit soft, to be honest with you. And then couple that with the surprise retirement of Matt Niskanen, and it's been an area of a fair amount of controversy on Flyers Twitter and in mainstream pundit articles as well.
Well, look, to be honest, even before the Matt Niskanen retirement, I was kind of clamoring for them to upgrade that defense because, Robert Hagg, I think he takes way too much flack on Twitter and from a lot of the Flyers faithful and just the analytics community as a whole. But I think that if your aspirations are to win a Stanley Cup, he's ideally your number 7. And Justin Braun, I like what Justin Braun brings, but I think we could both agree that he's nothing more than a fairly strong third-pairing defenseman. But couple that with Robert Hagg, I'm not so sure. And I thought in the postseason, it kind of showed that, yeah, there was room for improvement there. And I was kind of like asking for maybe an Alec Martinez ad at last year's trade deadline. And now you get the retirement to Matt Niskanen, and that hole becomes even more glaring. And I know Shane Gostisbehere had a pretty good night last night, and not taking anything away from him in that respect. But anytime you have Justin Braun and or Shane Gostisbehere as like staples in your top 4, it's not something I'd be completely comfortable rolling the dice on. And in terms of the physicality, yeah, it's been quite some time that probably I've never seen a team this quote unquote soft in my lifetime. Talking about the Flyers, of course. And I think it's become much more so apparent since Wayne Simmons got dealt. Because even though they didn't have much beyond Wayne Simmons, I felt that he was just such a, presence on that team, both offensively up until maybe his last season and a half, and in the physical department, that he made up for everyone else's lack of physicality and toughness. Now that he's gone, you really have no one who could fill those shoes, or even close for that matter. I even remember, let's say, the last season where the Flyers were really competitive and started this rebuild, the last season of Paul Holmgren, and they had guys like Scott Hartnell and Braden Shen and Wayne Simmons, and although they weren't quote-unquote fighters, but they had players like Nicholas Grossman and Adam Hall and Braden Coburn. Zach Ronaldo was also there. I'm not saying you have to litter a team with goons, but I think there is something to be said of having guys who can kind of drop the mitts. And you saw quite a few teams sacrifice quote-unquote skill to bring in toughness this year. Like the Toronto Maple Leafs moved on from Kasperi Kapanen and Andreas Janssen, and they bring in Wayne Simmons. They make room on the back end by shipping out TJ Brody and Cody Ceci, and they bring in Zach Bogosian. Like, I don't think anyone is denying that as a pure hockey player, Kasperi Kapanen is better than Wayne Simmons, or Barry is better than Zach Bogosian, but even the most analytical mind in Kyle Dubas realized that the Toronto Maple Leafs were lacking that type of game. Look at the Montreal Canadiens. Like, how long were we talking about that they were a small team, a soft team? The Flyers would always push them around. And, they go out, they bring in guys like Josh Anderson and Joel Edmondson, just to add to an already like no team to be taken lightly whenever you have a guy like Shea Weber on the ice. And I think the Flyers are missing that. I can't really, especially up front this season, I can't pick out one player in particular and be like, yeah, he's the problem. But I do find that the lineup up front is incredibly redundant. Like the difference and the role that the number 1 forward brings and let's say the number 9 forward brings is so small. And I think that when I see guys like Nick Aube-Kubel and Scott Laughton and also a bit Oscar Lindblom, but he brings so much in the intangible department that I struggle to kind of group him in with the rest. It's all just guys that, while they're good hockey players, and I would take them on my team every day of the week, I just think, and I'm talking more specifically about Laughton and Aube-Kubel here, I probably would have rather them replace those types of players with guys with some bite and some veteran leadership, because I do still think that this team lacks it. And I put out a tweet a couple days ago, and it's just like, if you could have gotten rid of those two guys and inserted some players like Matt Martin and Corey Perry, I think it would have gone a long way.
It's hard to put together what the team is. I mean, Nick Aube-Kubel does play with some jab. He's one of the few guys in the lineup, and he's not really a fighter per se, but he's an effective forechecker. Look, it's a fourth liner, and I think it's pretty clear that Scott Laughton is a third line winger or a fourth line center, and frankly, I don't really like him at center, but he played,
Me neither.
He played okay last night, but you know how that works. You can play okay for a couple nights. But to your larger point about the sameness of the players, along the spectrum of the kind of player they are and the different attributes they bring, there's not a lot of shooters. There's a lot of deferential play. There's a lot of, there's a little more speed here. There's a little more pure offensive ability there. But within a certain range, I would agree, from 1 to 9, there's a lot of similarity. The outstanding players, I mean outstanding in terms of differences, would be people like Konechny and potentially Nolan Patrick, who probably has more talent than anybody else in the lineup overall, and his impact on the game, if he can get to that level and stay there that people have been saying since he was drafted. So I think they definitely could use some jam in this lineup, but and that's really referring to what they could do in the playoffs. I think in the regular season, sometimes it's not quite as evident. In this particular season, the way it's so, truncated, there is going to be a lot more urgency, and I think that style of play is probably going to be more prevalent than maybe in other long, drawn-out seasons. So it's really hard to say. But let's go back. The bubble period is over. The Flyers are in the off season, and everything's getting cranked up. We hear about the retirement of Niskanen, and then what does Chuck Fletcher do? He kind of pulls a knee-jerk reaction and re-ups Justin Braun for 2 years at, 1.8. And that's about
Something
half
like
of
that.
what he was making, the year prior. But this is a declining player in many ways, and he's really just a third-pairing defenseman. I think when they picked him up, there was a hope that Braun could function on the second pair. It didn't really turn out that way, so he ended up most of the latter part of last season playing with Haig, and we saw Myers ascend to that pairing with Sanheim. Then they go and they sign Eric Gustafsson for $3 million, and we don't have to go on and on about that. Very similar in many respects, stylistically, to Shane Gostisbehere, who has been on the outs. His performance last night notwithstanding, not someone who's solid in the lineup that they know they're going to be going forward with. So it begs the question, if we could go back in that moment in time, what were the alternatives in the UFA market that would have been better? Maybe if Fletcher in what was clearly a buyer's market, had been more measured and been more patient, was there a possibility of going after T.J. Brody? Maybe trading for Nate Schmidt and absorbing the $5.9 million cap hit, having that extra space. Was that realistic, or was that a fantasy, or what say you?
Well, okay. Well, obviously the biggest pipe dream was Alex Pietrangelo, but it seemed like as soon as the door closed in St. Louis, he was destined for Vegas. It seemed like he never even entertained any other options, which is fine. But even besides Pietrangelo, I think that there was quite a few options on the table, and I thought that the two ones that made the most sense were Chris Tanev and TJ Brody. And by all accounts, that TJ Brody ended up in Toronto because he got the no movement clause.
Right, yeah.
And look, like, I would have preferred Tanev. I just think that he would have fit more stylistically for what the Flyers needed, especially handedness, and I saw him more in shutdown roles. I just like the player more, but I don't think it would have been that big of a difference if you would have gone the road of TJ Brody. But it seemed to me, and I can't speak to this specifically, but that they ended up shying away because of the trade protection and because of the term, and with the idea of the expansion draft. And to me, it's unacceptable, because if you're thinking about expansion while simultaneously trying to sell to the audience and the fans that you're in a cup window, you're doomed for failure, because we saw this, for lack of better terms, half-ass rebuild go on for 4.5 years under Ron Hextall, and look what we got. We got a team that's marginally better from the 13-14 team that he took over in the first place. So I never understood what he did in the offseason in regards to the defense. I thought that there was several good players out there. Like, I look at a team like Buffalo, who seems to have like a never-ending crop of right shot defensemen. I think so much so that one of them plays on the left side. I think it's Yoki Haru, but don't quote me on that, or Colin Miller, one of the two. But behind Rasmus Dahlin and the other guy who his name escapes me at the moment. But then, a guy like Brandon Montour, I thought would have been intriguing. Even a Ristolainen, I thought could have been a nice add. But for them to do absolutely nothing, and yes, I'm considering Gustafsson signing as absolutely nothing, to address the Matt Niskanen thing, for me was the most irresponsible thing I've seen a general manager do in Philadelphia in quite some time. And, we were talking before off air how you compared it to Hextall's handling of the goaltending in 2018. And I would tend to agree with that. And I would almost say that this is arguably worse, especially for a team that's cup contending, because under Ron Hextall, we were never once sold a bill of goods that had cup contention in there. But with Chuck Fletcher, ever since he got here, it seems like that's been the mandate. He's never come out and said it, but I mean, his moves are indicative of it. Like, you don't sign Alain Vigneault and that coaching staff along with Kevin Hayes to a $50 million contract if you're not hoping for a Stanley Cup in sometime in the near future. So I think that there were a ton of defensive options out there to replace Matt Niskanen. I don't want to hear about expansion. That is a cop-out to me. I don't want to hear about the potential of losing Travis Sanheim. I don't care. I think Travis Sanheim is a fine second-pair defenseman, but he is not the type of player that I'm going to, block, like use as an excuse to block outside transactions. I think he's someone who's incredibly expendable as a result of Igor Zamula and Cam York. And when I spoke to Anthony Sanfilippo a couple months back, he said as much as well in regards to Travis Sanheim. So look, I was very disappointed. And we can't even use the excuse that, they didn't have cap space, they didn't have options, this, that. No, it was just Chuck Fletcher tried to go the cheap route. And he re-signed 3 incredibly mediocre defensemen in Braun, Haig, and Gustafsson. Although I didn't mind the Justin Braun signing, because I think when deployed properly, he's an effective defenseman in a reduced role. And I felt that he was more important to the team that people gave him credit for last year, bridging the gap to Phil Myers becoming a rock solid option on that second pair in, I want to say, late December, early January. But I just think re-signing Haig and signing Gustafsson instead of going out and getting a legitimate option was just inexcusable on my part.
Well, I'm not going to disagree. Tanev is a name who's kind of like, I think, maybe a little bit of a tier below Brody, but not that far. And he's a right shot. So he was another one. Nate Schmidt is a player who shoots left, but often plays on his right side. I think, what did Vancouver paid the Vegas third round pick for him?
For Nate Schmidt?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was a second.
Okay. That's probably the best of the bunch. Now, he came with a 5.95, I think.
Yeah. If I could interject for a second,
yeah.
The only reason is that Nate Schmidt is the best of the bunch, like 10 times over, but he has kind of fallen flat on his face in Vancouver, and I just worried how he would be not playing next to. I want to say that he was playing next to Alex Edler on their top shutdown pair all last season. No, not Alex Edler. Shea Theodore.
Shea Theodore, yeah.
Yeah. So he's playing next to Alex Edler now. So I had some trepidation as to whether or not he could translate that top pairing play, and we've seen that in Vancouver. But you're absolutely right that Schmidt would have been a better option than Gustafsson.
Yeah, the thing about Schmidt, he's been so backward in terms of offensive and defensive zone starts that, he's handled some heavy minutes. He always keeps his feet moving. He has very few penalty minutes. I always look for that for defensemen because they play a very, very contained game, and that's something I really liked about him. And yet he's physical and very efficient. I think it could be just some growing pains in a new market, a different system, and all that. But it's pretty clear that there were some maybe higher risk options for the Flyers that might have entailed putting someone like Sanheim in the crosshairs of expansion. And we know that Fletcher had a tough time with that in Minnesota. And maybe he's overly sensitive to making a move that would put him in a situation. He lost Alex Tuck. And who else did he lose when he was in Minnesota?
Eric Halla.
Right, Eric Halla.
And that was in the effort to protect guys like Brody, Dumba, Spurgeon, Ryan Suter, but I'm pretty sure he had trade protection.
He had to hold those guys. Well,
did I say Brodeen?
Yeah, Brodeen. So there were chances that there were opportunities, I should say, for some different choices that might have put the Flyers at a decision point come expansion time. But harkening back to what you said earlier, the Flyers have not won anything since 2012, but more to the point that you were mentioning, they've been rebuilding since 2014. This is 2021 now. That's 7 years is an eternity in professional sports. Chuck Fletcher was brought in by Dave Scott and the Flyers management to get the Flyers out of that mode of kicking the can down the road. The team finally makes a breakthrough, gets in the playoffs. Yeah, they fall flat. They were outplayed. I've talked about that many times. So what you do is you say, listen, we got to take another step forward, and we have to deal with the circumstances cap-wise that are dealt to us. And we see that there are other teams around the league that have been able to do that. They seize an opportunity, and they say, hey, listen, we got something here. We got a goaltender finally in Carter Hart. We took a hit with Niskanen, and we really got to make sure we replace that jam on the back line with some veteran leadership. And we mentioned some names here. And we want to do something up front and maybe swap out some younger players, maybe throw a veteran in there. Like you talked about a Matt Martin. He's not really my favorite guy. I think he was always going back to the island anyway. But still, some kind of player who gives the Flyers pushback. The Flyers did fairly well last night against the Devils. The Devils are more of a finesse team. Outside of Miles Wood, a player who I'd love to be on the Flyers, by the way, and a couple other guys on the Jersey team, they're not the kind of squad that's going to give the Flyers problems. So the Flyers play the Devils tomorrow night, and then they have that back-to-back versus the Islanders, and I think there's going to be an exposure there based on all the things we've been talking about that Chuck Fletcher failed to address.
Yeah, it's the same team, right? Like, especially now with Eric Gustafsson out, it is pretty much the same team minus Matt Niskanen, and you insert a healthy Oscar Lindblom and Nolan Patrick. But it's, I don't want to say that Chuck Fletcher doesn't know what he's doing, because I tend to give NHL general managers and head coaches, for that matter, benefit of the doubt. But I really question what's going on. And he's been very quiet, which I found maybe not irresponsible is the correct word, but just I found it very odd that he had such an underwhelming offseason, and there's just so much of it's seemingly an uprising around this team given the stagnancy of the franchise for the last 8 years or so, that he hasn't really given a clear indication of what's going on there. And for all intents and purposes, you can maybe speak better to me than this, but there's nobody higher in the organization than Fletcher anymore aside from Dave Scott, correct?
That is correct.
Because he assumed he was the he took over for Paul Holmgren, correct, as the team president of the hockey ops?
Yeah, he's from the Comcast side of things, and they all kind of integrated that. So he wasn't really a hockey guy. He was like a CEO kind of position, kind of like Peter Luco was before him, I believe. Okay. So, yeah.
And now Chuck Fletcher took over as president of the hockey ops department as well, I believe. So, look, like, this is the Chuck Fletcher show. And I don't want to say it's worrisome, but it was always kind of, even though I was so sick of him by the time 2014 came around, I was always kind of assured in a way that, yeah, Ron Hextall was the general manager, but Paul Holmgren was the president of the team. And for a lot of those years, Ed Snyder was still there. And, Bobby Clark, although in a very reduced role, was the vice president. Now it seems like it's carte blanche for Chuck Fletcher, and he has full reign because the only guy that can really step in is Dave Scott. And as long as Dave Scott is happy and they're making, let's say, playoff money, I'm not sure if he's ever going to step in, if that makes sense. So I see a team that is built for regular season success. They're too talented not to get into the playoffs. Like, something would have to go catastrophically wrong. They have a generational defenseman. They have a budding superstar in net. They have a talented crop of forwards that have overachieved in my eyes early through this season. And, I couldn't expect them to be scoring at this rate. If you would have asked me before, I would have told you they're crazy scoring this much early on. But as you said, you're really not physical. They have holes on defense, massive holes. And I think that it's just a team that they're going to go into the playoffs. They may get out of the first round, especially now in the East Division. If they finish second and go toe-to-toe with the Pittsburgh Penguins, I could see them winning. Although I think Crosby would give them fits, that defense specifically. But, I just don't see the urgency that I would have expected when Chuck Fletcher took over to take this team to the next level. Because, like you alluded to before, they took a step forward last season. Yeah, the playoffs were a massive disappointment, but I don't think anyone could objectively look at this the team last season and say, oh, yeah, this was just another dumpster year. Like, no, they took a significant step. It's kind of sad that we have to say winning a playoff series is taking a significant step, but it was. That's just the fact of the matter. But to do nothing to build off that is just very, very disappointing. And, I always bring it back to the 2008 Philadelphia Flyers in 08-09. The season prior, they had lost in the conference final to the Pittsburgh Penguins. They did relatively nothing that offseason. They did wonders in the regular season again in 08-09 with a very talented crop of forwards, but not so great goaltending and a very shallow defensive group. and they got booted out in round 1 again by the Pittsburgh Penguins. And again, that team, when you have Jeff Carter and Scott Hartnell and Briere and Gagne and Richards and all these guys, Homeroom could have theoretically gone back into 09-10 with the same group because of just how talented the offense was. But he made significant changes. And, you bring in Chris Pronger, you bring in a brand new goaltending tandem, you bring in Ian LaPerriere. And, I think that was those kinds of moves. Like, obviously, there's no Chris Pronger available nowadays, but I think it was those types of impactful moves to propel this current team to the next level that we're lacking in this offseason.
Yeah, that's the frustration. I mean, Matt, your podcast mate, sometime contributor to Brotherly Pod, Manny Benavides, wrote an article in Brotherly Puck that talked about a lot of these, these scenarios and choices that Chuck Fletcher made that we're talking about. And while I didn't agree with every angle, every take that he had, the overriding point is one that we're making here. I think Chuck Fletcher had to be a little bit bolder, even given the circumstances of the coronavirus and the flat cap. It's time to get creative. And to try and maybe play it conservative, bank cap space, and make a trade deadline move, in such a short season, by then the damage is done. And I think that you can add a little more jam toward the end of the season, but that defense is going to be a problem all year long. And when you go into a season and we get a player like Gus, who just, I don't care if he's off to just really off to a bad start and he'll find whatever his game is. It's not what you need to push this thing forward as we're in 2021 looking and waiting for everything that Ron Hextall started to come to fruition finally. It's an eternity in sports, and I think it is not adequate for what they really need to do. It's very frustrating.
And, I put out a tweet, I believe it was on Saturday or Sunday. It was following the big loss to the Bruins. And I said, because I saw a lot of people pointing the finger at AV, and, he's not innocent in all this, but I just can't get there right now as, again, blaming the coach. And I saw some people blaming Hart. And I said something to the effect of, they have a group of players that have lasted 9 years, 5 head coaches, if we count Scott Gordon, 4 if not, and 3 general managers. And while I'm not going to sit here and blame guys like Couturier and Giroux and Voracek, and you can kind of lump Raffl and Lawton into that group as well because they've been here for so long, I'm not going to blame them for the last 7 years or whatever it's been. But at the same time, you've changed everything around them. And yeah, they're missing holes on defense, but we saw a defense that I think theoretically could have won a Stanley Cup last year with Matt Niskanen in there if they had like a more adequate forward group, and they didn't do it. And I just don't know if, as the salary cap is currently constructed with these guys, 3 guys over the age of 30 making 30% of your cap. Kevin Hayes signed long-term, although I like that signing. It's still, you're invested a lot of money in there with him, and he's going to get old really, really quick. Then you have the Sean Couturier extension looming in the not-so-distant future, and by the time that kicks in, he'll be, I want to say, just about to turn 30. I have a lot of trepidation as to whether or not they can get this thing on the rails in time. And it's not even me questioning the talent. Like, they have the talent there, but as the cap is currently constructed, I don't know if there's a way to turn this into a cup contender, because it feels like there's just so many moving parts, which are even more complicated now in a salary cap world, or not in a salary cap world, a COVID world where the salary cap is just so difficult to, get out from under. I'm just very, very skeptical of whether or not they can fix this.
I can't disagree. The multitude of factors, many balls in the air that Chuck Fletcher is dealing with right now, and he seems to be hinging on being able to clear a salary through expansion, hoping that some players can play their way into a certain level of value, like Gostis Bear or perhaps JVR, and eventually being a player or in the free agent market when that space is available. But what happens between, now and then is what we're seeing out on the ice. And I think it's going to improve. I think they're going to be a playoff team, but I think they're going to need a defenseman all year. And we said that before the season started. And nothing I've seen is going to make me feel differently about that. The performance of Shane Gostisbehere notwithstanding, I don't think it was revelatory. It was okay. He kind of fell back a little bit as the game went on. He hasn't played all year. That's to be expected, and he just came off of battling the coronavirus. So I don't think he's a top pairing defenseman at his best. He should be in the top four, but you have Phil Myers somewhere in that mix, and then it's just a matter of who stylistically can complement Sanheim if Myers ascends to that first pair. By the way, just some news. Myers showed up in practice today, so his return is probably sooner rather than later, barring any setback with that rib injury that he had. So I think that's where we're at right now. There's a lot to like, but I think there's some extra pieces here. And one thing we didn't mention was all the duplication and all the pieces that could be available to sweeten up any kind of deal in that F9 and below category or F10 and below category. The Flyers have a lot of the same kind of player, not only in the top 9, but also, from F10 on. There's a lot of F10, 12s potentially in the offing. So I think that's where we're at.
Well, it's because there's always, for the past couple months, there's kind of been like this, well, it's not a power struggle because we're not fighting over power, but there's kind of been like an impasse among Flyers Twitter because, I'm of the few that think that I'm of the thinking of if you're not winning a cup, I don't know what the point is of plugging along here. And I don't well, I'll throw it to you first with the question, are there any realistic acquisitions they could make this season that can make them win a Stanley Cup?
No.
Exactly. And it's not and I do think if you added a top tier defenseman and maybe 2 forwards that brought some bite, I could see it, but where are you getting those forwards, what
they need? Honestly, he's not available. Don't get me wrong. But if you inserted like a Colton Parayko next to Provorov, you could start making plans for something. Because you can always get your Matt Martin light, like a Miles Wood. Those guys are always available if you're willing to pay the price. And I just got done saying we have all these young guys that could replace a Miles Wood from the New Jersey perspective. Would you give up a Wade Allison or, Lashinsky? If you're ready to go, if it is go time, yeah. But the Flyers don't have any kind of facsimile of a Matt Niskanen and Colton Parayko or anything like that. And they don't, I don't think they're going to have access to any of them unless it's via trade.
Yeah, and the thing is I had said before the season, and it was even me kind of overrating the defense. I said, maybe they could go out and get a Jason Demers, but as we talked about last week, Jason Demers isn't going to fix this. No. Jason Demers would be, I don't know, let's say the Montreal Canadiens want, a depth guy to play on their third pairing.
A Band-Aid.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, exactly. A guy who could come in, play decent minutes, and whatnot in a third pairing role. But this team needs something maybe not quite an Alex Pietrangelo type, but they need that type of guy. They need a big hulking defenseman who could eat a ton of minutes. I've seen a lot of people say Josh Manson. I don't think I like Josh Manson, but I don't even know if he's the answer. One guy for whatever reason the past couple days, and I don't even think he's on the block, and this is complete spitballing, but like a Brent Burns, like maybe that, like a guy who could eat that many minutes, and he's a big guy, and this like a type of player that completely changes the look, or that could change the trajectory of this thing. And I don't think that there's any guy that is out there right now. Like, by all accounts, the best type of defenseman that may become available in season is Hjalmarsson, providing he waives his no movement clause. And is Nick Hjalmarsson going to make this team a cup contender?
No, he'd be a better Band-Aid, but he's not the same guy he was in Chicago. He's not a bad player. It would be an improvement, because he can handle really tough minutes, and that was the need coming into the season. Hasn't been met. The players that they have coming up soon, like Zamula and Cam York, aren't ready to handle anything like that just yet. And only York, in my mind, projects to be someone who should play in the top four.
Yeah, Zamula, I think, will be a fine NHL player, but first of all, I think he still may be a year beyond this out, given there not being an AHL and no means for him to develop. And talking with Mark Seidel, he said as much. I'm confident in Cam York. I think he's going to be a good player in this league for quite some time. But, I mean, again, like, I don't know if he's the guy that's going to magically change the trajectory of this thing. Like, I mean, even, just to give you an example, like, we talk a lot about Cale Makar out in Colorado. But I think a guy that people don't talk about a lot is an Eric Johnson, who eats those tough mitts, that old school type of defenseman that can still play in the modern day NHL.
Yeah.
That's the type of player the Flyers need, and that's what Niskanen was. Like, even just like, and look, I think Ivan Provorov is a generational defenseman, but I think there's something to be said of the Flyers not having like that elder statesman back there, that guy who can calm everything down, even on a bench and whatnot. And I don't think that type of player is available right now. And
no. And we have elder statesmen when we've had them before, when we had Andrew McDonald, and we have a better version of him in Justin Barron, but that doesn't count. You have to be able to be really good against the best players.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Like, again, like I think Justin Braun's, like, I don't like to nitpick on the guy, but think about the role he played in San Jose. He played behind Brent Burns in his last year there. He played behind, Erik Karlsson. And in his younger years, he kind of played a shutdown pair with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who's a former, Team Canada defenseman. Yeah. And, we're quite a few years removed from that. Like, I don't like to nitpick on specific guys here, but at the same time, it's, I don't know. It's just very, very, it's discouraging because I don't see a way out of this. Because, okay, so let's forget about this season. What about next offseason? Do you think anything like this could come to fruition this summer?
It's so hard to tell. I mean, right now, 1/3 of the league has LTIR issues, right? And the teams aren't going to opt for that because it hurts their daily cap figure and the availability of money toward the trade deadline. So that just goes to show you how everything is so tight. Going into next season, what's going to really change everything is how the teams handle expansion. And Seattle puts their team together and how much salary they'll be willing to take from teams that practically every team in the league has a contract that they really want to get rid of. So I think that's going to shape what happens going forward. And I've talked about on previous shows where there's a player like JVR gets sent to Seattle, but it will cost you somebody like Bobby Brink. If that's what it takes to clear out that money, I think you're going to see a fair amount of trades like that. And then there's going to be trades where the teams are jockeying for position to make sure they can keep their players protected without having to pay the ransom that you might get from Seattle. They might get a better deal from another team that is trying to do pretty much the same thing or trying to exploit that situation.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of moving parts here, and but like before we wrap this thing up,
Yeah.
I guess I'll just ask you one of the most polarizing questions that have come on Twitter in the past couple months.
I think I know what's coming.
What do you do with Sean Couturier? Is that what you thought was coming?
Yep. That's the one.
And to a lesser extent, Claude Giroux, those two guys.
Yeah, Claude Giroux is up after next season, and so is Sean Couturier. Well, you wanted to change the look of the team. That's one way to do it. I mean, Giroux, I could see them moving on from, again, depending on what happens after this expansion. So you have Couturier just turned 28. Sean Couturier is somebody who's had some knee injuries. He's been nicked up. He's never been the greatest skater. And now he would want to get paid in the, $9 million range or something like that, being a Selke Trophy winner, scoring 70 points.
Yep.
I think a lot of it depends on Nolan Patrick. If Nolan Patrick becomes the player the Flyers think that he can, and Morgan Frost becomes a player who could step in, I might walk away, or I might move on. I might try to move Sean Couturier next year, because I don't know if I want to. I don't know if I want to repeat the mistake that they made with Giroux. They're having so little cap space that they couldn't put players around them. Now, a lot of it depends on the expansion, moving JVR's deal, maybe not signing Giroux, Voracek. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, and they have to prioritize their defense. But if Nolan Patrick looks like a number one center, or you could trade Couturier to a team that has a budding number one center. Let's say Florida says...
yeah, that's the guy I was going for.
Barkov is not happy in Florida. They're very similar players. Barkov's a little bit better offensively. Couturier probably does a better job on the defensive side of the puck. And Couturier is very popular among head coaches because of his structure that he can provide. And we've seen that. The Flyers are definitely missing it. And Barkov's younger, so they'd have to maybe pay a premium combined with the fact that the team would have to have... I would trade him for Barkov. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is.
Yeah, this is all spitballing. It's because...
Yeah, this is honestly, all pure spitballing. We're not breaking any news here.
Well, it's because Dan and I brought this up as well, because I still do feel the Flyers missed the boat with Pierre-Luc Dubois. I thought, and I know he has his issues, attitude-wise and everything, but I thought, you're not, and even Patrick Laine for that matter, although, that was more of a pipe dream. The Flyers need more help down the middle for the future.
Yeah.
But I still, those types of players don't become available all the time. They just don't. And I think Barkov is the only other one, depending on what continues to happen in Florida, that could become available. And I mean, I'll just ask you this, if it took, because of the difference in age, would you package a Patrick along with Sean Couturier for Alex Barkov?
No, you can't do that. I mean, I would think about Morgan Frost, but no. Patrick is the fallback. You gotta. I mean, you have Hayes. Hayes. I don't think that Hayes is going to be as problematic as maybe you do going on because of the kind of game he plays.
I don't think he's going to be problematic. I'm still comfortable with Kevin Hayes, and I still do that that signing every day of the week. It's just I would be very skeptical to push forward with Couturier and Hayes locked in at a combined $16 million when they're well into their 30s.
Yeah, and not only that, they're not offensive dynamos.
Exactly.
So you don't have a lot of offensive creativity and they're not catalysts out there offensively. And it is a lot of money to tie up into players that really don't provide that element. So yeah, I could see that. I actually that came up in a listener Q&A whether they thought that contract would age poorly, and I don't think so. But you bring up a very good point about how dynamic is this center crew if you have Kutza and Hayes making all that kind of money. So yeah, and as far as Pierre-Luc Dubois, well, what are you going to do? Couturier's hurt.
Yeah, no, and look, like I checked in with some people, and I think another thing is that I think this fan base kind of has to get a grip on is that a lot of these players that they think are going to get them things, like when we heard about Line A back in October, it was all Sanheim. Well, no one wants Sanheim for that type of player. You know, it's Provorov, Konechny.
Yeah.
And and don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have gone down that road. Like Provorov to me is untouchable with heart. And then right under those two is Konechny and Myers. As like, I'm not trading them, but if you want to blow me away, maybe. Would you concur with that?
I would concur. I think there's a possibility that Patrick could enter into that category, but he's got to prove it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's fair. But like, even a guy like Morgan Frost, like,
yeah, I mean, look, I like the player. It really hurt him not to play over this last 10, 11 months. We really don't know what we got. As far as I'm concerned, I'm waiting about a year from now to pass judgment on him. If he really doesn't show a lot of progress, I will be concerned. But I'm going to wait a year for that. And I think Oscar Lindblom sentimentally is untouchable in the eyes of the fans. I don't know how the front office feels about that. They probably have to be blown away for Oscar to get moved just because of the intangibles there. But yeah, no, I agree. But yeah. I don't know if we settled anything today, Anthony, but hopefully we expressed some opinions that were cathartic for the fan base that is tired of watching this move down the road at a glacial pace. It's not unreasonable to think that the Flyers should be a little bit better this year, even with all the obstacles, and that Chuck Fletcher, in the final determination of what we've discussed today, should have done more to address the team needs, particularly on defense. I'll give you a final word, and then why don't you give us your social media coordinates?
Yeah, I'll just say that all this talk about this team is because I truly do think they have significant pieces here to win a Stanley Cup. I think they have the defense, like the defenseman and Provorov. They have the goaltender. They have some really good wingers that I think are going to be here for a long time. I'm just skeptical of how they're going to move forward. And we're talking about all these potential trade scenarios or facelifting potential cases only because we do think this team has significant potential. And we want better. We just want better because I don't want to see guys like Provorov and Konechny and even Sean Couturier, who's still in his late 20s, be wasted like we saw the previous core get wasted. And so, yeah, you can get me on Twitter at ADeMarco25. You can find my work at thefourthperiod.com.
Terrific. And you can yell at me at Isaiah, ISAIAH, _520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. And, of course, you can follow the O&B Puckcast on what I believe is 12 different podcast formats, YouTube, of course, Apple, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, Deezer, if you like that, Radio Public, and, of course, follow all the latest Flyers information at Flyers Nitty, that's KNITTY, at Flyers Nitty for FlyersNittyGritty.com. So until Monday, February 1st, after those two Islander games, when we come back with Amy Johnson from Rocket Sports to give you a recap of all 6 games, looking forward to that. Everybody, take care.